Appreciate that. Item 13 is the divestment policy revision engagement. Chris Ailman, our CIO, is going to lead this. This is information, and although in the past we have taken information items and have taken action on them in the same meeting, I'm going to ask that this policy revision simply be received as information and some clarifying questions today. And given the importance of a policy such as this, I'd like for us to hold off on any adoption of it. So we'll just take it as information now, and any feedback for Chris and the team. Chris?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Harry. This has been a real good first reading because I've received lots of feedback on this. I have to say this was a request that Sharon Hendricks made 2 years ago, maybe 3. Hey, why do we have a divestment policy? Why don't we have an engagement policy? And so we're finally taking a hard look at that. Clearly, opening the divestment policy is difficult to deal with. But what we are proposing is that we change the name and call it an engagement/divestment policy. We clearly state what you have for a long time, your views on divestment. Quite a few of the feedback I got was from the legal counsel about whether we should reference the legislative authority or not. The purpose for that was really to help our shareholders understand the contrast between your authority and their legal focus, which is very different. That is unusual for your policy because it's theirs by law, but it's also, we see it a lot with when we talk with CTA and CFT, is a lack of understanding of when the legislature tells you to divest, how that's different criteria that you have to look at than they have to look at. The other suggestions, we're looking for word guidance at the beginning of that policy where we talk about divestment is an investment tool, to make it clear, because that's the only way you can divest. And whether it is the final option or final attempt, last-ditch effort. I had a suggestion from Karen Yamamoto about final option at risk management, and I think I actually like that more, but we're open to that. Also, there was an encouragement from Harvey under the divestment. We list 3 different ways that you could consider divestment. He's proposing, I believe, that we add, and I don't want to speak for him if he wants to comment, that we add a 4th one about the fact that if there's a de minimis impact to the portfolio, because that's primarily what we have used on things like U.S. coal, firearms, non-U.S. coal. And then also the option he has raised recently about the fact that if there's an alternative investment of equal or better return, lower risk, equal or lower risk, equal or lower cost, we could substitute that. And so we could add that more into the definition of what would be considered. The purpose of the divestment changes is really to help drive home and clarify that the legislature has been proposing to you divestment, and they have to answer to the public. They have to look at what's important to the state of California. You have a fiduciary standard just to the members and have to look at risk and return. So it's 2 different criteria. We don't get into, I had originally proposed getting into the legislation and actually making it clear here what Harvey had suggested in the past, that you consider opposing all legislation. We're not putting that in because the concern that would belong in your legislation policy. So I'll talk to Grant Boykin and whenever that comes back to you to consider that. But it really was to help you because we've seen a myriad of divestment bills brought up by the legislature this session. Who knows how many will really go through, but I think the pace that we have seen has just continually increased year after year. Then the other proposed changes, the second paragraph or first full paragraph on INV 56, people found that wording confusing. That wording's been in your policy for a while, and it really just deals with the fact that you change the benchmarks when we divest. So our benchmarks are X tobacco, X firearms, California, X coal. So we still follow that index. But when we want to buy futures, we have to buy the S&P 500 futures or the Russell 3000 futures. You can't buy a futures contract that's X those things. It's a derivative, so it doesn't own the underlying instrument. But that's all we were simply trying to pick up. And then the other nuance, you've had in there for a long time the recognition that you can't divest when something is in a partnership because you don't actually own the underlying security. Harvey Brett raised a good point is what about future partnerships? And so we'll have to work with legal counsel to come up with a phrase that deals with when you divest of an area, we will put future investments in partnerships on notice that we have chosen not to invest in that area. As I mentioned in the Cole discussion, we have side letter language in all of our partnerships that give us an option to opt out of an investment if it's in one of your restricted divestment areas. So that language is in there, but we could add a sentence on that. And then lastly, Harvey raised the question, I think it's a darn good one. We're proposing changing the reporting cycle from quarterly to semi-annual. His question was if you have a long-term horizon, is semi-annual even too frequent? Should it be more annually? I did have some questions from Jack and others about should we report to you a breakout of every single divestment, how much firearms cost or how much coal cost? We could do that. The challenge is we'd have to buy numerous more custom indices from the index companies, which means a higher underlying cost. Right now we pay one fee to be X everything, but we would have to then subscribe to X this, X just that, the individual ones. So when we give you a divestment figure, it is a total cost of all the divestments from the date we did it against a baseline normal benchmark. So that's a discussion to you. We can go and get a bid and find out the cost difference if that information is useful to you. We also can look at it. What we have done when you have asked that question is just run back and kind of done a Bloomberg search and tried to back into the number, but we don't have a hard number that we can track for you. So those are the changes I wanted to present to you that we've already received once the agenda went out, and open it up to questions from you. I hope, we're meeting the need of adding engagement if that's what you would like, and balancing engagement and divestment properly.
Thanks, Chris. Some questions. Ms. Dillon.
So, Chris, I think you've done a tremendous amount of work in the very first reading of this. And I appreciate that you took our comments when we were having the discussion in the board about legislation and the position or statements we might want to make when we have to face divestiture bills from the legislature. I'm just wondering if we put this in this policy instead of in a legislative type of statement, or even if we put it in both, what type of handcuffs are we putting on staff? I mean, there might be times that we don't exhaust all efforts before we divest. There might be times that I just don't want to. I'm just not quite sure that the paragraph where it's talking about the legislature is the appropriate. This is the appropriate place for it, I guess.
Okay.
And I think we can talk about that. I think I kind of like the softer language in the policy here in our engagement policy, and then maybe going to a legislative that is saying, yeah, this is what we're going to do because this is our legislative stance.
Okay.
I just want to make sure we don't do anything to cut our nose off to spite our face.
Gotcha.
Are you talking about the language on IMD 54?
Yeah.
The second paragraph up from the bottom? I just want to make sure I'm,
Yeah.
okay.
Anything else, Ms. Dillon?
No, not right now. Thank you.
Mr. Hellman, you okay with you?
Yeah, no, we
Okay,
can work
good.
with it, try and figure out what the right
All right.
structure is,
Yeah.
and the nuance there. And we had a lot of debate, just email debate with council. Is the point of referencing it is just as I said, that to recognize, particularly for the public, which is unusual for policy. Normally policy is just for you and us.
Yeah.
But this has such an external audience. This is probably one of the most requested policies we get. And people want to know, you have a divestment policy, how do we deal with this? And they ask for this. That's a real subtle nuance that's not common in every other state, where we do see these bills passed and signed by the governor frequently,
Yeah.
and you face that challenge. So I think it's valuable to bring it out, but I agree that the language about what you will do with legislation belongs in your legislative policy. I just know people look here, so I thought it was
Right.
helpful to start it here.
And not necessarily have to send people to multiple places, but.
No, right, you want to send them to one place and,
Complicated issue with a complicated policies. It's gonna take some time to flush it
Yeah.
out, so I hope no one's feeling pressure that we have to get this all
Yeah.
resolved today. If we don't, it's gonna take time to evolve, and we'll get it
sadly,
right
it took
over
me a
time.
couple of years to
Yeah.
get Sharon's suggestion
I
here,
know,
so.
it's okay.
I-
That's okay.
I'm still listening,
Patience.
so it's all good.
I'm
Mine is
saying it's okay.
Cincinnati.
Exactly. Exactly. Mr. Rosensteel.
Thank you. Chris, on INV 55, that first paragraph under divestment, that's where I have some questions. So the last part of that lists three conditions, and they're connected by an and. So does that mean that all three conditions have to be met before we would divest?
No, it should be, or.
Should be or. That's what I was wondering. So then let's go through those one at a time. So the CalSTRS ESG policy is violated over a sustained time frame to the extent that it becomes an economic risk to the fund. So that basic idea there is that there has been engagement hasn't worked, the company continues, or that industry in general has continued to violate our ESG policy, and we have determined then that this industry is now an economic risk to the fund, right?
Correct.
Okay. The second one is that a potential for loss of revenue exists. Seems to me, maybe I might suggest that we have a stronger word than potential. Potential, there's always a potential for things. Maybe, a high potential or an expectation or
likely.
highly, something like that. I think it needs to be a little bit of a higher standard than just a potential. Then I think that Harvey's suggestion would be a third one, and I'll wait to ask you about the number 3 here in a second. Harvey's idea that we can divest even if we don't meet these other criteria, if we conclude that it's an immaterial impact on the fund, which seems, at least as long as I've been on the board, the criteria we've used every time we've done a divestment. And so then there's that last one, and this is the one that I've just got some confusion about, and I'd like some help on it. The investment is determined to weaken the trust of a significant portion of members of the system over a sustained period of time. So, first of all, it seems to me that well, let me ask a question. What kind of trust are we talking about? Trust that we're going to be able to achieve the investment objectives that we as a board and as a system want. I mean, what I want to make sure is that it's not an issue of trust on a social or political basis, because I think it's been made very clear to us all along that can't be the basis for a divestment policy. So if that's true, maybe we should be clearer about what kind of trust we're talking about here. I also have a hard time understanding how we would make that determination. How do we gauge the level of trust of our members in what we're doing? We have, close to a million members. We have some who come to our meetings, and we have stakeholders who speak on behalf of our members, although they're not necessarily represent all of the members, and we hear differing viewpoints from different stakeholders. So I think this is a very difficult thing to implement. It's also in the ESG policy. And so I have a real concern about incorporating this concept into either the divestment engagement policy or the ESG policy, because I have unless somebody can tell me how we're going to gauge the viewpoint of a significant portion of the members of the system over a sustained period of time.
Great question. And it's hard to define. We don't have a clear way to measure it because, as you know, we do a lot of survey of the members. We have an awesome, research survey team, but we're lucky to get a small percentage of the teachers to respond. This was in your prior policy. We've added the term over a sustained period of time at Harvey's encouragement. And I think part of the reason it was in your policy over the past, it really gets back to reputational risk. And I don't know how to define trust more precisely, so I'm totally open to ideas there. It gets back to the recognition that you as a board feel a lot of pressure from members in the membership about the reputation, the confidence that they have in CalSTRS, and the confidence they have in you as board members. And I agree, it's a tough fiduciary line, but it's the recognition that you're a public body. And particularly, Paul, this came up a lot in the tobacco discussion. So it is things that are probably more socially unpopular, and there's no way to gauge the level of interest. It's not illegal, but that if you ventured into that area, I'll bring up a topic, foreclosure of loans. Foreclosure is a very profitable business, but obviously if we were kind of in that business, that would probably weaken the trust of our membership of being vultures. So it's trying to balance, the sentence was put there back with tobacco to try and balance that you're looking at fiduciary issues, but you also have to be concerned about just broad reputation. We list that as a very high risk to the system, the reputational risk, because it would then damage you in other areas, not necessarily just a financial loss to the portfolio, but it might damage you in things like your budget authority or your legal authority or legislation, different areas like that. So guidance around how to word that better, I'm totally open to, but I know the origin of that was back in that time period and trying to pick up that nuance that board members felt the pressure from the membership and wanted to recognize that in their policy.
So I appreciate that, and that's good history that I wasn't aware of. I think I still struggle with sort of how we determine that our members feel that way, and I know we hear from some of our members. I must say, in my life, I have friends and family members, quite a few, who are CalSTRS members, and I just ask them, well, what are you concerned about with CalSTRS? And I will tell you, not a single one says anything about, there's two things they talk about, okay? One is my pension going to be there?
That's right.
And they're really concerned about the whole interaction with Social Security. That issue I hear all the time. And I never hear about anything else. I never hear about environmental or social, any of that stuff. Now, I'm not trying to draw conclusions that are necessarily applicable to all of our 1 million, close to 1 million members, but I'd like, and I know we do surveys. We know that self-selecting respondents to surveys don't give us necessarily the most scientific response. So, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we should only care about those who speak up, who have enough engagement with CalSTRS to want to respond. But I guess I'd be interested in Harvey from a fiduciary standpoint. I mean, we're not supposed to think about social and political considerations, but as Chris defined the element of trust and reputational risk, is that a legitimate thing to be concerned about when we consider a divestment policy?
Question was addressed to Mr. Lieberman, who's our fiduciary counsel, so he's going to respond. Harvey?
Thank you, Harvey Lederman, Reed Smith, Fiduciary Counsel. The conversation indicates to me that maybe we went too fast on changing and to or. Because by making and or, we made that item a standalone of sufficient weight in and of itself to base a divestment decision on. I hadn't thought of it that way, and I don't know if the board ever considered it that way. It seems to me that in the context that if you go back to and, in the context of once you've decided that our ESG policies have been violated for a long period of time, and there is a material risk of loss to the system, and there's a reputational risk to the system in combination, that should be sufficient to bring you to a divestment decision, and that's sufficient. If you look at that as a standalone of itself, I would say no, it's not sufficient by itself on which to make that, because reputational risk, as we know from national politics, is in the eye of the beholder. And it gets you into a conversation, but it doesn't get you to a dispositive impact financially on the retirement system, and that's really what we're all about. So I would suggest perhaps we re-examine that quick determination that and could be switched to or, and maybe reconsider that.
That's helpful.
Great, thank you very much, Chris, for your answers, Harvey, for your help on that.
And you'll
I
continue
think
to.
this is a really good start.
He says actually, he's right, I did jump too quickly to or. The old policy, because remember, divestment came out of the benchmark modification policy that was developed in 1999, and it was and, because they wanted 3 different criteria. And what we could do is make the first 3 all ands, but then also put or it's de minimis or an alternative investment could be found. So we could find a way to balance that too.
Ms. Paquin.
Thank you. I appreciate all the work that staff has done on the divestment policy, and appreciate the changes that we talked about today as well. In regards to the frequency of the reporting, I think an annual report is sufficient. And I think it is interesting to break out the pieces of the individual divestments, but maybe that could be done once every 3 years. I don't think it has to be annual. And I think my question is also in regards to the issue that Paul brought up. And I was wondering how the firearm divestment came about, and I was wondering if that was a question of trust. After Sandy Hook happened as a public education pension fund, I would think that, would be a special circumstance that everybody could recognize that the action had to be taken and quickly. We didn't have a long period of time to wait and see what was going on with the actual investments.
You want to respond to that?
Yeah, I can respond. Part of the reason it was so fast is the engagement period evaporated. The 2 companies specifically at first said they would talk to us on the phone, and then when we sent our formal letter, they sent a letter back from lawyers that said we would not talk to you. They wouldn't even talk to us on the phone. They wouldn't allow us to come to the company and do anything with them. And so it was very clear very quickly that there was literally no engagement opportunity with the 2 companies at all. And that's why, but you're right, in terms of, because we divested of companies that had products that are illegal in the state of California, it was very hard analysis to figure out, they sell the identical same products in Nevada, and then things with online and all the challenges. It was very difficult to figure out how that was going to have a financial impact or not. And as Harvey pointed out, I think you pointed out, it came back to be just simply being de minimis to the fund, whether we own those 2 particular companies or not. And I think that's where the public trust side definitely kicked in. You couldn't prove that it would be a loss to continue to own them. You couldn't figure out what was going to happen legislatively at that point.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, if there was another situation where you had something that happened that directly impacted schools, and it was not a de minimis amount, and there had not been a long engagement period, then how would that be handled under this if we kept the and in those clauses?
Tough to theorize. Every engagement, every divestment that we've done has been different. None of them have followed an identical pattern. I can tell you when they have been very material, like an entire industry, we have really taken the time to travel, to visit with them face to face, to even visit with them multiple times. I know in the past, before my time, the board actually brought CEOs in to engage directly with them and have a frank conversation. We would take the steps of teaming up with people. When it gets to the point that it's very material, then we also get really deep into security analysis, because you're trying to figure out, in this one case, it was the huge threat of massive class action lawsuits. We had to try and handicap how likely those lawsuits would be. And we tried to engage law firms, consultants to help handicap, and no one would. They all refused to. So it does get to be very challenging. Then you really are just doing investment security analysis and trying to predict an outcome. And that may be in our future at some point, when we'll just have to cross through it. I think in almost every case, we've been one of the leading funds in the country in having to deal with a lot of these issues before our peers. So,
Thank you.
Ms. Packman. Ms. Glazer-Hedrick?
Hi, thank you, Chris, on all your work on this policy. It's been enlightening for me to get into the details of divestment. I do have a question, though, along Paul's line of reasoning. It appears as if in the ESG policy, the last clause has been removed. And I was just wondering if there was a rationale why the clause discussing that the investment weakens the trust of a significant portion of members over a sustained period of time, why it had been removed from the ESG policy, but it remained here.
In discussion with Ann and her staff as we were working on the ESG policy, we were trying to go to just a broader scope policy that was more principles-based. So, I think we could easily consider it in both or out of both, or have it in either place. It's recognizing in both cases, though, you are dealing with investment risk, but then you're cognizant of the reputational side of the risk. And Ann is here to answer, so I don't have to answer for her.
I might be jumping ahead a bit, and I apologize.
We moved it. If you go to INV 63 and INV 64, we actually moved that. So it's kind of a two-part test. We first have the, material CVAR calculation to see, what the losses would be. And then if you look at the top of INV 64, under the ESG policy, the CIO will assess the gravity of the ESG risk to the fund as to how it could weaken the trust of a significant. So we sort of separated them. You first do the one test, and then we go to the second test.
Okay.
So we separate them. The language, though, as Chris said, is what I would call legacy language from our previous policies that we continued in at least the ESG policy.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Anything else? Thanks. Mr. Unterman?
Okay, I just had two types of comments. One is I'm looking at the policy on divestment and the three-pronged standard, whether and or. I agree it should be and. It strikes me that item 2 could be better stated is if we focused on a material loss of value as opposed to revenue. So, for example, a non-dividend paying stock, that would never be applicable. And a further thought on that phrase would be whether we should be looking at a concept more like we have in the 21 risk factors policy of value at risk in that asset category as opposed to material, because if our largest holding in our equity portfolio is 1%, you could argue that, again, that this is never going to be triggered. So just that, phrasing that. The other thing, that I just point out for everybody that in terms of economic value, these issues come up on really the far end of our portfolio, or the tail of, in terms of value to our portfolio. We've probably divested more consumer retail stocks, traditional consumer retail stocks in the last 3 years than any category that's likely to come up other than fossil fuel, just by virtue of the way the market works and the indexes work. And that when coal came up, it had essentially all been divested, but a very small tag end of the portfolio. So there is a certain element of self-correction in the index itself.
Anything else, Tom?
No.
Thank you. Ms. Higa?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chris, for all the work on the revisions to the policy. You went over in your presentation some of the issues that Harvey, our fiduciary counsel, had raised. But one that I don't think you addressed was the issue of that some of the items in our 21 risk factors are country issues, not necessarily company behavior. So I just wondered if that's something that we might consider addressing in the language around engagement, because I don't know that we'd engage with share owners or companies, or I guess it's a question, would we engage with share owners or companies around issues that are controlled by the government in the country where they reside?
Rule of law, monetary system.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a great question by Harvey. It made me ponder. They're included in our investment analysis. And we could include some kind of a carve out or some kind of a recognition. It has most often come up when there was the threat of conflict or war with that opposing country. If the U.S. declares war against somebody and we have investments there, we're at risk, and obviously reputational risk. And there's no point in engagement. That's not our role in that kind of a geopolitical conflict. So that's a section we can easily go back and look at. It'll be hard to figure out the right wording, but I think picking up something in recognition that where engagement is impossible or fails is not going to achieve any outcome because it's with a foreign government, then we can move right to the consideration of a divestment.
And it may be that it's not necessary to add language because, in looking at the draft, the reference to the ESG policy and which I think would encompass the 21 risk factors is really in the divestment section, not in the engagement section. So perhaps it's not necessary, but it's something you might take a look at.
Okay.
Ms. Dillon?
So Chris, something that Joy just mentioned kind of triggered a thought with me. I guess I see to me, it looks like the language that we're putting together here has to do with, say, an issue that comes before the board, there's concern, or there's been efforts to encourage us to divest or whatever. But within our corporate governance, we as a board decide on initiatives that we want to take and how we want to engage corporate boards and entities that we have ownership in. I can't recall seeing something within this policy that includes that. So would that be something that we might want to consider also, that sometimes these are board initiatives?
Like in that opening paragraph where we talk about our corporate governance is a critical part of our investment process. Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll give that some thought.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other comments, a lot of feedback, thoughts on the policy. Assume staff in the minutes will reflect that, and you'll continue to craft this and work on it. It's going to take some time to get it right. We have
All the time in the world.
we have a lot of time.
All the time.
Given
Come back and get it right.
Yeah, given the list of issues that we're all dealing with, Chris, make sure it's prioritized correctly in your world, please. Thank you. Yes,
Just
Madam
that
Chair.
said, and I don't need the floor,
Yes, you have it though.
there's a tremendous amount of policy work that we're looking at today. I would echo that on all the policies that we're looking at today. Thank you.
Okay. Item 14 is an action item, ESG Sustainability Policy. Ms. Sheehan, this is the third reading, coming back with some recommended changes or additions from last reading. Before I turn it over to staff, I know we have a member of the public that would like to speak to the item. I'm going to ask that she address us now. Kirsten Spalding from Ceres. Welcome. Yes.
Speaking on behalf of the Investor Network on Climate Justice Series, CalSTRS has been a long-time leader in the network, and we look at your leadership around, particularly around the policies that you move. This policy on corporate governance, we think is moving in the right direction. Focusing on principles rather than on specific items, we think that's the right direction, and it gives us the flexibility to address changes and trends in different sectors, in different asset classes around the portfolio. The corporate governance report that we heard just now indicates really how thoughtful CalSTRS has been in addressing both environmental, social, and governance issues across the public equity portfolio in particular. We did have one concern about the CVAR analysis and this question of when an issue rises to the level of being considered material. I think in this latest draft, we see the inclusion of the 21 risk factors, and that comforts us with the sense that those issues are still a priority for CalSTRS, and we understand that that list could evolve over time. We just want to be sure that we're not narrowly defining materiality by quantitative determination of whether or not this meets a loss threshold. Certainly, many issues could be material in a small sector or with a relatively small number of companies, but present a great risk to the sector overall. We would also just note that the level of engagement can differ. So where you're going to see a huge impact on the portfolio, you may want to put a lot of staff time and energy into the issue. Where it's going to have a relatively small impact on your portfolio, but a large impact for the industry, you might want to spend a small amount of staff time joining with other investors, for example, through our network or through other organizations. Your voice could be very important because of your size and prominence in the public sector. So we really appreciate your leadership and look forward to seeing how this policy moves forward.
Thank you very much. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Ann.
So as Harry said, this is the third read of the policy, and the policy, we've come back with some edits to respond to the suggestions from the board the last time. And I think if you look on INV 62, we kind of put some comments in the sideline that hopefully help navigate. And then I can respond to Ms. Spalding on some of the suggestions and some of the comments that she had. So, Paul, I think you had pointed out, you're trying to say, what are we trying to accomplish with this? So we moved that paragraph down below up to the front.
We can't, the audience can't hear her. I don't know if you got to get right on top of your mic.
Okay.
It's just very difficult to hear,
Okay.
even for us up here.
Okay. So what I was saying is we came back with comments to respond to the comments that the board made at the last meeting. So the first change we made was in the very top paragraph. We had moved that up. That was down further in the text of the policy before, where it says to help manage and guide the risks and opportunities. So that really clarifies what it is we're trying to accomplish in this policy. We also, a lot of people thought, is this the policy that guides ESG integration? Is this the investment policy? So we put some language in there. There again, it's the blue line, trying to clarify that the integration is not the goal of this policy. Rather, it's the engagement, the ESG risk, and there are other places in our investment policy where those decisions are made.
And I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Okay. One of the questions that has come up is this in the investment policy where we do the integration of ESG into our investment decisions. And this is really more the ESG risk policy and the engagement policy and how we identify those issues. So in each of the asset class policies, we talk about the integration and we talk about how we make this policy available. We send it to our managers so they're making decisions on our behalf and looking at the risk factors. But it is not this policy specific that is intended to be the integration of ESG into the portfolio. It's rather to help identify the engagement and the management of the ESG risks. Then finally, a couple others, so we moved that up. We had, the chair of the committee had asked if we could put in the language about consulting with the chair and the vice chair of the investment committee. And that is on page INV 64 in the redlined version. You'll see it highlighted there. Couple of other things I want to point out. The stakeholders, the issue on the CVAR, and Chris, I think Carissa gave us some examples.
A handout. We had a handout to give you as an example of the CVAR. Basically, the CVAR, think of a traditional bell curve, nice statistical distribution. CVAR is designed to identify the extreme left-hand tail. And so it's picking up the variability of every respective asset class, because you can imagine the bell curve for fixed income is not as long fat-tailed as the bell curve for global equity, and the bell curve for private equity is even longer fat-tailed. So it's nice because it's variable for that, because we do have a big complex portfolio. But it basically tells us, and I think to hit on Kristen Spalding's comment, it helps us gauge the level of activity we're putting into this engagement. Obviously the simplest thing we can do is write letters to management. But then we can step up and make phone calls and visit management and visit them several times and then make them come here. Numerous ways to engage them. And it's a guide to tell me how much staff to throw at a problem. So I want to alleviate any concern of a stakeholders group. It isn't a hard threshold of it has to be bigger than this or not. It's just one of the series of tools. You asked us, particularly at the subcommittee level, you asked us, we've got to have some definition of materiality. Well, by nature, that means some things get above the line and some things don't. Doesn't mean we ignore the small problems. We just don't necessarily throw the entire staff and you at that small problem. If it crosses over that CVAR line, you're going to know about it and it's going to be on your agenda and you're going to be spending time on it. So we have an example somewhere, and I'm looking around, the staff will show up with it, of a CVAR on the global equity portfolio. I think Harvey asked the question of would coal have made the CVAR criteria? And the answer is no, because as Tom pointed out, those stocks had already started to drop rather precipitously. It had maybe when you started the discussion on coal, but not at the point when coal was there. Would the oil and gas industry, or particularly as we hear numerous times from fossil-free California, ExxonMobil, would that industry make it? Absolutely. So think about CVAR as the line where your time and attention is going to be taken up, but issues below that. Dana had asked us about Arista. That was the chemical company that had a chemical product. I don't remember, Arista was the company, I don't remember the name of the chemical used in strawberry fields. Frankly, that wouldn't have made it because it was one product out of 50 at this company. This company was one out of 15 investment in that private equity fund, and that private equity fund, we were only about 8% of it. So it would not have made the threshold that it would have taken up your time, yet it did. So in the future, we'd have that line to draw. And we'll get the example. We have a mathematical example of how CVAR is calculated. To answer the public question, yes, it is complicated, but it should be because we're such a large, complex fund. It's a moving number as the volatility of the portfolio changes and as the assets change.
I'm just going to ask if it's okay with the committee. I'm going to allow the presentations to go through on the remainder of the agenda, and we're going to take questions and comments after each item. I'm just looking at time and managing the rest of this agenda. If we continue at this pace, will be here well past 6 PM. So I think we'll be more efficient if the chair is quiet, you continue with your presentation, then we can ask questions after each one. Thanks.
So, picking up on Chris's point, and I think this is one of the concerns from the stakeholder groups, while we have the CVAR test in terms of the materiality and how serious it is, we will still continue to engage on the issues as they come to us, and we'll identify what but it'll all depend on the resources we throw at them, the priorities. You'll continue to hear about them in the annual reporting, or as there are questions that the board members may have. So I think one of the other suggestions of the stakeholders is at least annual reporting on our ESG engagement, which is something we can add a line in here. We do that, but we can certainly put it in the policy so that it's clear. We will report on our engagements, whether they hit the CVAR or whether they don't hit that material calculation. We can report back to you on those. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and I think you saw this on the ESG risk factors, there were comments at the last meeting about the 21 risk factors, and so we added the remaining ones that had not been on there. And as we note in the footnote, we will also add other issues as they become potential risks to the portfolio. As Ms. Spalding said and Chris has said, they are evolving issues. 10 years, 20 years ago, we may not have thought climate change was an issue that is on there now, or some of these other issues that we have on. So that will be sort of a living document, and it helps to, I think many people felt comfortable with the 21 risk factors, that they had been developed over time, and that they'd helped identify some of the issues that we engage on and what the things that we see are the risks. So we felt it was helpful to put it in as an addendum to this policy so that people could see that those still exist as issues that we continue to work on. So I think those are the issues in terms of addressing some of the concerns of the stakeholders. I know some of the board members have raised these, and then I think we can answer any questions that you may have. So we will add reporting language to this policy for sure.
Very good. So with that, we'll go to questions. Ms. Hendricks?
So I want to just ask about CVAR and ask, is this being used? Chris, are you watching YouTube videos during the break?
No.
Those kiddie videos?
We're all working very hard to get this out here to you.
No worries.
Panicking about it.
No worries.
My phone went off,
with
sorry.
the CVAR analysis, to kind of help quantify materiality, is that being used with other institutional investors, or is there a history of using that? Alan, you put your finger up?
No.
Okay, okay.
We are blazing the trail.
Okay.
And with your permission, particularly for those of you who don't work with other funds, the amount of time and effort you put into this broad category is 1 million times what almost every other large institutional investor in the country is doing. And just in terms of time management and how you're dealing with it, part of the reason to have QVAR was to limit the amount of time that you spent on these issues so they could be managed in a more efficient manner. But it really is a disproportionate use of time in terms of how it impacts the portfolio.
And that sounds like that might not be a good, anyway, I'll take that as, so move on. And then can you highlight, so Anne, you said that you would add into the policy the annual reporting piece, because that's not, I might not just have seen it. Where in the policy right now does it talk about, is it QVAR? Is that CVAR? Sorry, CVAR. You said QVAR. Anyway, CVAR, how CVAR is not the only kind of tool being used to assess materiality, or is that language, because you were talking about using CVAR as part of the assessment of materiality, but I just wanted to.
If you look at page IMB 67, that's under the process. So that is the ESG materiality threshold, the calculation of the CVAR. And then once that is done, then the CIO assesses the gravity, and this is where we're talking about the trust issue before. And to the extent, we devote the resources to do that, The staff will directly engage, and then following the engagement, report back. And then at the end of that is the sentence that says, if the CIO determines that the identified ESG issues does not present a material risk, then we'll still engage. So it's the materiality on those steps, but then we can still engage on issues that haven't reached that threshold, but we still feel are important to engage for the system.
But in letter A, where it talks about staff's approach to determining an initial ESG materiality threshold, we talk about quantitative, which is the CBAR tool, correct?
We talk about the quantitative, and then the B
And when it
is the
says-
qualitative, the risk to the system.
Okay. Okay. I guess I'm just trying to understand when we look at this policy, that it's clear what staff are using as a threshold for materiality. And it sounds like it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative, and I'm just trying to get more specificity. With the quantitative side, it's using CBAR, right? And with the qualitative side, it's using, Alan, sorry.
I don't believe there's going to be a significant change in the way things are being done.
Right.
And I think that's what needs to be said. We're not looking at a change. This is a glacial change. It's
Sure.
at best incremental. And you're relying on a judgment of your staff, and you don't want to get too detailed.
I understand that. I guess I just, I'll move on for now. I guess I want to understand staff's thinking on what qualitative means, not the quantitative side. That's all I'm asking.
I think, Sharon,
can move on.
I think what we're trying to actually accomplish is not change behavior, but manage people's times and
Right.
also expectations of external groups as to how much human capital and financial capital we're going to invest in any given issue that comes before us. Because it can be of great significance to individuals and to organizations outside of CalSTRS, but it will divert human resources and
Right.
financial resources and our time
Right.
if we respond equally to every issue that comes before us.
I'm just arguing that when we look at a policy or when the public looks at the policy, they should be able to read it and understand what we mean when we say quantitative and qualitative, and I don't totally understand what we mean. So if I don't, as a board member, understand it, then.
Excuse me, I mean, I don't think I have a comment about one part of the two in the whole that I'll make later, but I don't think two can be any more clear. The staff is saying one of the 21 risk factors is triggered. I mean, I don't know how other way you can write it that's more clear. I'm sorry,
That's your opinion, Tom. It's fine.
All right. You were next in the queue, Tom.
Go
You
ahead,
jumped
Tom.
in. You're all set? You're done?
no, no,
take a break
but
after this
I actually
I know,
was gonna start by commending the staff for creating clarity here. And that CVAR, I thought, was a very clever way to do that and set a standard that cuts across asset classes, which is one of the things I wanted to emphasize, and I think maybe we could emphasize more clearly, because all of our divestiture discussion talks about stock. And it's very much in my mind that at one of our last meetings, we had a long discussion and presentation about from fossil fuel, fossil-free California, about oil and gas stock and oil and gas stock. And then the very next item on the agenda was a build-to-suit office building for an oil company. And the dissonance struck me. So I think we want to make clear that this applies to all asset classes in the portfolio. And then the last thing with respect to that factor 2, which I'm now trying to find again in my screen, where you're taking into, once 2 starts out, you trigger one of the 21 risk factors, and that would become an economic risk to the fund, and we've got value at risk. I would stop there. A potential for material loss of revenue is a phrase that it doesn't quite work. It could be a potential loss of value, but then that's what you just said in the earlier phrase, and maybe you could, with being more concise, it would underscore the fact that we're making reference to the 21 risk factors. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you. Ms. Dillon?
So before I start my comments, I have a tendency to agree with Sharon that if we're writing policy for the general public to understand, we should do everything in our power to make sure that we're using terminology that they understand, and if they don't, that we explain it as best we can. So I just want to make sure, and because I had a whole different vision and set of comments until your presentation, so I'm glad that you defined that for me. So I just want to make sure this policy is what staff is to do when an ESG issue raises to a potential risk. And then these are the steps that staff would follow, correct? Okay. Then, and that we have ESG in other spots. So let me ask you, are we putting we just got done doing an engagement and a divestment policy that was brought together, put together one spot, so when somebody asks for it, we can give it to them. Are we putting our ESG policy in way too many spots? So I just want you to ponder that, okay? So then, and then we don't normally, in our policy, at least that I remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we don't normally put in our policy what staff does. And that's like more in a guidelines or something, and I understand that we want to be responsive to people that come and talk to us about the things that we ought to be involved in along the lines of ESG, but are we moving too far away from what we do in our policy? And then, because this is going to come back to us again, I know. Even though this is our third reading, I think it will come back to us. So then when we take a look at the 21 risk factors, and we've put that into the matrix that we have them, it's designed to be revised as issues become material or cease to be material. And I guess I just don't understand when one of these would cease to be material. I mean, it's going to be risk by risk by risk, whether it's material or not. And I just don't see why we would say that this is a fluid document other than maybe adding things to it. So and you don't have to answer that here. That just seems strange to me. I mean, if we put are designed to be revised as necessary, I mean, it just seems weird that we're going to say some of these are going to drop off. I can't imagine that corporate governance is ever going to drop off. Do you know what I mean?
I think when staff drafted that, it was to sort of, I don't want to say hedge, but, something in the future it may have been addressed, or it may no longer be a risk. So I think it was more of a sort of protecting us on both sides.
Okay.
But we can add, I think the language that you just said, it was meant to be that this is a living document. We may add things, but we also at some point in the future may subtract something.
Yeah.
So I think it wasn't intended to say, this is going to come off.
Right.
If it was more to communicate that this is a living document, a living list, and things may come and go over the years.
Okay.
But we did not identify any particular thing that we thought would come off anytime soon.
Because in one country it might be this, but in another country it's going to be this, so here it's going to be that. I mean, just.
It wasn't intentional that we would
Okay.
pull something off. I think it was more of just a way to communicate that we could add and subtract things as these risks, may come and go. I think that was the intention, but we can certainly go back and look at language that may more accurately reflect that this is a document that will be a work in progress, and as things arise, something like that. So it isn't as, so there may not be signaling to people that we're going to take off things.
Because
if that's
when
the
it becomes material or cease to be material, I mean, we've divested from things that weren't necessarily material. Right. I mean, so that kind of threw me. And then, Alan, I guess my bottom line question for you is, are we getting too prescriptive?
Yes.
Then I want to throw that out there too.
So, yeah.
Sorry, Eric.
No, don't,
okay.
you don't have to apologize. It's just, yeah, let Mr. Untman, comment, and, we're gonna do something we haven't ordinarily done around here. After Mr. Untman's comments, we're gonna take a 5-minute break.
Okay, so let's just go back to the beginning of why we're doing this, which is to make clear that which we are delegating to the staff so that there are matters that do not have to come to the board unless the staff brings it to us. So I think we have to be clear about that. And therefore, it covers a lot of ground. But I think it's going to be an important thing for the working of the board that we won't have, and a lot of our stakeholders won't feel they have license to bring to the board all these things that the staff would just as soon deal with directly in an appropriate way. So that's what this is about, and I agree with Dana's comment that this policy should be very parallel to divestment standards. That's why I suggested using the CDR standard there, because then we're in sync. But that's a very different thing. That says under what standards will we divest? So I mean, I think it all works together well, and I'm very happy to delegate a lot of this area to the board, to the staff.
So there are a few other people that are in line to speak. I'm gonna ask that we just take a break for 5 minutes and come back with Mr. Rosensteel, Ms. Paquin, and perhaps we can wrap this up one way or the other and not spend much more time on this. If we have to bring it back, we'll bring it back. Okay.
Thanks.
Why don't we spend a few more minutes on this item, and if by, if anyone who hasn't spoken, who wants to speak on the issue, please, you'll have an opportunity to speak. If you've already spoken on the issue, I don't think any more needs to be said, and we can either make a decision to, approve this, move on, table it for another time, but we need to be sensitive to time and work that's gone in. So, Mr. Rosensteel.
Thank you. So, I appreciate the effort of staff to clarify things, and maybe I'm still a little dense, but I'm kind of with some of the other committee members who say they still find this confusing. And let me tell you why. There is nothing here, this talks about, and I'll just read 4 places where it says what this policy is for. It's to manage and guide the risks and opportunities of investing in a global portfolio, a process to follow when considering a potentially material environmental, social, or governance risk, intended to direct staff on how to measure and manage ESG risks that might arise within CalSTR's investment portfolio, established to guide and manage the consideration of ESG risks and opportunities, evaluating a risk pursuant to this policy that potentially triggers CalSTR's ESG policies. So there's nothing in there that limits this to a consideration of anything other than every single one of our investments. I mean, our ESG policy is that we should consider ESG risks about everything we invest in. So, as I read this, let's say we're currently not invested in ABC Widget Company. And then one of the indices that we replicate adds the ABC Widget Company. Now we're supposed to go through this process to evaluate all potential ESG risks related to ABC Widget Company. So we're supposed to take a step of, the first step is doing the CVAR analysis of all potential risks related to that company. We're also supposed to evaluate whether a material loss of revenue exists. So we've sort of double defined what material is. It's both CVAR and then we say material is material. The CIO then has to assess the gravity of the ESG risk and how it could weaken the trust of a significant portion of the members of the system. So Chris would have to do that with respect to every potential ESG risk in ABC Widget Company. Then the CIO would have to make a judgment. Okay, hopefully in most cases at that point, he would make the judgment that we don't have to do anything more. But just all of that, including the CVAR analysis, would have to be done on everything. Now, I don't know that that's the intention here, but that's the way this actually reads, because it doesn't limit the consideration, which is what I think we're trying to do. We're trying to say, when an issue pops up, this is how we deal with it. But it doesn't just doesn't define what constitutes an issue popping up. And our policy is we have to consider every possible ESG risk before we invest in something, and then decide whether it's a material risk. And if it is a material risk, then we have to engage on it. But how do we define what's an ESG risk to engage on if we don't start from square one in this policy on every single investment and every single possible ESG risk? And that's why I think this isn't going to reduce the amount of work that our staff does. It's going to increase it astronomically. So I think while I completely share the reason that why we're trying to do this, I think it's a very well-intentioned policy. I think the way this reads doesn't get there because it doesn't address step one, which is how do we decide what investments and ESG risks to put this very comprehensive process under the microscope with. Because as it's written now, every single investment and every single possible investment risk would be subject to it. Which is why I've always thought that we do much better by having an ESG policy that kind of says, look, there are material risks. We care about materiality. We don't care nearly as much about things that are immaterial, and we have a much harder time from a fiduciary standpoint dealing with things if they aren't. And we don't need to start from scratch. I mean, SASB's done a lot of this work, right? They've looked industry by industry. They've identified ESG risks that they think are material or not material based on research they've done. It's always seemed to me that what we wanted to do was to say, you know, there are experts in this field. We're experts too, but maybe we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are experts in this field who have the concept of materiality has been well defined in the investment world for a long, long time. We don't necessarily have to redefine it. The question of materiality of ESG risks has been looked at by Ceres, by SASB, by all sorts of people. Again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And maybe we can rely on that process to then say, oh, okay, now here's a risk that we do need to engage on. And if we can't successfully engage on it, then we have to think about what to do next, maybe divestment. But so I'd really like to see this. I think we should start from scratch, and I recognize all the work that's been done, but I think we're trying to fine-tune something that just isn't getting us where we want to go to. So.
Fine question from the staff. The idea was this would reduce workload. Would it actually increase your workload?
You know, it's hard to say. Potentially, if we had to go through every single step for everything investment, obviously it would increase our workload. I guess a couple of things I'll say, and then, you know, I'll ask Chris, because as we take a step back, the idea was this would replace the 21 risk factor policy, you know, that we sent out to our investment managers and they report on in terms of making sure they're looking at that risk, and then also how we engage. So, and we were trying to go from sort of a rules-based to more of a principles-based, which was the discussion at the subcommittee. So we didn't identify every single risk, although we did add those at the end. And I think the other thing that we were attempting to do is respond to the committee in terms of we should engage really and focus on the material issues that are important to the portfolio. You know, as I think we've said in my program, we'll still engage on so many of these issues that may not raise to the material level, but that are important to engage on because they could potentially become material if they're not handled properly. And those are a lot of the issues that we engage, like on SASB. I mean, they could become serious material risk to the portfolio if not handled properly. So that's, I think, what way back when we did the subcommittee was the intention of trying to revise the policy. But I certainly understand what Mr. Rosenthal is saying, perhaps some of the concern of some of the members. So we could come, you know, perhaps what we could do is come back with a engagement policy in the discussion that we had in divestment, because we'll still continue through our CG principles. You know, we lay out the engagement where we see risks to the portfolio and other issues that we engage on, and then the one-off issues. I think one of the things that we need to think about is we have this list of 21 risk factors that we have created, which has become the impetus for people to come to us and say, this triggers your risk factor, and so we need to do something about it. And that's how at least my staff, and I think Chris and other asset classes, have been confronted by these issues as we've had to engage with them. So I think the intention was to try and come up with a more rules-based or a principles-based policy as to how we address those issues. So, Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything.
You hit it on the head. The goal here was to not necessarily reduce our workload. You want us to integrate ESG into everything we do. The goal was to clarify your workload. It was you had a rules-based policy and you wanted to go to a principles-based policy. And that you as a board wanted to set a level of materiality that you would have to look at. So that's the goal. Sounds like we didn't achieve it in this version, but I think we'll keep aiming for that goal and take all of your input and come back at it.
Okay, very good. Ms. Paquin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, thank you for your comments and your work on this, Chris and Ann. We also were concerned about the use of the CVAR analysis, and I appreciate the example you gave us today. And clearly, a very limited number of investments would rise to that threshold. And so it seems like it would just be the status quo approach in what you're using and going forward. So in that regard, we don't think that the CVAR is helpful at all. I think it just is more confusing for the stakeholders. And then the other issue that we wanted to raise is that the controller does believe that the ESG issues should come to the board. And if there's any changes to that, she would like to suggest that the board be made aware of the issues that staff is and is not engaging on, and even if it's a consent agenda item or an informal report, doesn't have to be a presentation every board meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paquin. I think everyone who has wanted to speak has spoken. Anyone who has not yet weighed in? Okay, so I've certainly been in plenty of places where the intent was really great and a lot of work and effort has gone into something, but we clearly have not gotten to the level of consensus and comfort that we would all want to do, and there's no harm in acknowledging that and just stepping back and reevaluating at some future date, and we'll continue with business as usual. The staff will continue to consult with the chair and vice chair around issues, and the chair and the vice chair can determine whether an issue comes before us or not, and will remain as status quo. This does not get thrown away. It's something we can work together on in terms of when we want to look at this again. My sense is there's not a level of support to continue down this path at this time with these changes. There's that. I think there's people that we're talking past each other right now, not in any harmful way. We're just talking past each other, and I don't even think we're hearing each other well. So that's not a good time to make a decision, so we won't. So thank you for your efforts. I'll continue to consult with the staff on when and how we proceed, but for now, we'll just continue with the policy as is, business as usual, and we'll bring this back at an appropriate time, maybe in November, maybe not. No harm, no foul. Is there any objection to that approach?
Sounds good.
I think that's the least harmful decision to make at this time. Okay, thank you.